Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patrick Costigan. I work in the Secretary's office here at HUD, and welcome to our third webcast in a series on HUD's recently issued notice on the Rental Assistance Demonstration, or RAD. Today, we want to share with you the proposed implementation details of RAD as it applies to Section 8 Mod Rehab properties and the options for owners of these properties. First, let me introduce you to my colleagues. To my far right, Greg Byrne in our Office of Public and Indian Housing, Diane Thompson also in our Office of PIH, and Margaret Salazar in our Office of Multifamily Programs. Hopefully by now most of you are familiar with RAD, which was authorized by Congress last November in HUD's 2012 appropriations bill and based on our FY12 budget proposal from last year. You may have also viewed some of our previous webcasts on RAD, all of which will shortly be posted on our RAD webpage, which is www.hud.gov/RAD. In this webcast, we'll go into greater detail on the eligibility criteria, application procedures, and program requirements that apply to converting assistance for Mod Rehab properties, which is found in Section 2 of the Rental Assistance Demonstration Notice that we issued last week. Along the way today, we encourage you to send in your email questions, particularly as they relate to Mod Rehab, under the demonstration. And you can send those questions as we speak today to rad@hud.gov. It would be helpful if you, in submitting your questions, if you'd offer your name and your organization along with your question. And once we conclude our overview of today's presentation, we will take those questions. Most of you know that one of the main purposes of RAD is to generate additional sources of financing for public housing in 3 of the multifamily legacy programs, or sometimes called the orphan programs. That is the Section 8 Mod Rehab program, the Rent Up, and the RAP program. And the purpose of this is to ensure that long-term preservation of these properties. RAD will test this by converting assistance to long-term, project-based Section 8 rental assistance to better access private debt and equity investments needed to recapitalize these properties. For Mod Rehab properties, given that it's been many years since many of them have undergone rehab, the need to recapitalizing using long-term Section 8 contract will be especially critical. Also, another important goal of the rental assistance demonstration is to offer residents choice and mobility in where they live, which we'll be discussing in some detail today, but you'll also find additional information on this choice mobility component in the notice. As a reminder, Public Housing Notice 2012-18 with respect to Mod Rehab is proposed and intended to solicit your comments. Once we have your comments, we'll thoroughly review them, then issue a final notice guiding RAD's implementation later this spring, and we're reminded that the month of June is included in spring. To get us started, I'm going to turn this over to Greg and ask him to give us an overview of the rental assistance demonstration. Greg?
Good, Pat. I'm going to go over to the whiteboard, which we've used for the previous webinars as well. Here we have the RAD sort of conversion authority. So what's important to understand about the RAD program is there's 3 different ownership types and 2 elements of the program, or 2 components. So the 3 ownership types: public housing, Mod Rehab, Rent Up, RAP. And what we'll show here is that a Mod Rehab is unique in the sense that it is eligible for both components of the demonstration. So under the first component, for which public housing and Mod Rehab are eligible, that these properties can convert either to project-based rental assistance, what we often say multifamily housing, administered in Margaret's shop by the Office of Housing, or to Section 8 project-based vouchers. So you have the choice of doing it, but one of the constraints under this is that the Congress gave us the authority to have 60,000 units convert under this first component of the program. So Mod Rehab owner can compete. So the second part, as they said, is that under this component, there's a competition. They have to sort of compete for it. And a third sort of major defining element under this here is it's at current funding. So for the Mod Rehab owners, we'll talk more during the presentation, is really you're bringing over your current contract rents if you sort of are elect for this element of the program and are selected. The other alternative for Mod Rehab, or the second component of the demonstration, which is also true for Rent Sup Wrap, is that the owner can take at contract expiration or termination, they can take the tenant protection vouchers, or what we call TPVs, the tenant protection vouchers that would normally be issued to the residents of that property, the eligible residents, and they could get to convert it to project-based vouchers. And here, one of the major differences is that there's no cap. There's no program cap on the number of units, although it is subject to the availability of funding for tenant protection vouchers. And each year, the department has a pot of tenant protection vouchers for public housing demolitions and dispositions, opt-outs in the multifamily programs, and these sort of contract terminations and expirations. So our notice is organized, PIH Notice 2012-18, such that the first section of the notice is public housing, the second section of the notice is Mod Rehab, and the third section of the notice is Rent Sup and Wrap. And so again, Mod Rehab is the one inventory that actually is allowed to sort of has the ability to go to both components of the demonstration. Just the last couple things, Pat, before I turn it back to you, is so there's 60,000 units for this first component of the demonstration. And since we were given this authority by the Congress, the department in its notice has proposed that 58,750 units would be allotted for public housing and 1,250 units would be allotted for Mod Rehab. And the reasons for that is because public housing has about 1.2 million units, Mod Rehab has about 25,000 units, and those figures, 58,750 and 1,250 over here, are representative sort of proportions of their inventories is how we sort of divided this up. And the last thing to emphasize is that the only part of this notice that is effective today is the Rent Sup Wrap, that their ability of Rent Sup Wrap owners to sort of convert their TPVs to PVVs, they can do it immediately. We'll still take comments, but everything else, the public housing and the Mod Rehab, which is why we're here this afternoon to talk about Rehab, this is all proposed. And so we have a schedule. It's a 30-day out for public comment. That ends April 9th, and then we'll look at the comments and expect to turn them back around and issue a final notice in June. But until that final notice is issued, that for everything we're talking here for Mod Rehab is all proposed.
Thanks for that overview, Greg. That looks like we've got a few options under Mod Rehab. Diane, I want to turn to you now. You've done a lot of work with Mod Rehab over the years. Can you help us understand, well, let's start with the eligibility criteria. How does this work for Mod Rehab?
Sure. Pat, under the first component, eligible properties are those that are under either a Mod Rehab HAP contract that has not actually reached the end of its original 15-year contract term, or Mod Rehab contracts that are currently under a one-year renewal HAP contract. Under the second component, that's under the first component. Under the second component of RAD that's applicable to Mod Rehab, projects are only eligible if they are under a Mod Rehab HAP contract subject to a one-year renewal. So the difference between the two is that under the first component, we're allowing owners to terminate their contract before the actual expiration date of the initial HAP contract. And under the second component, we're not allowing owners to terminate early to reduce any extra strain on the tenant protection account.
So beyond that, are there any other differences between the first component and the second component as it relates to Mod Rehab that we should be aware of?
Well, under the first and second component, the eligibility requirements are basically the same. Owners must be in good standing with HUD and the PHA and have a history of compliance. Also, all units must be in decent, safe, and sanitary condition as determined by the administering PHA as of the date of the PHA's most recent annual inspection. And the owner must be in compliance with all fair housing and civil rights requirements.
All right, let's go back to the first component for a minute, and let's talk about how rent setting will work.
Okay. Generally, Pat, rent setting is going to work for the first component based on whether or not it is a PBRA conversion or a PBV conversion. Under PBRA, rents will be established based on current rent levels, current contract rent levels. The rents will be capped at the lesser of current funding or 120% of the applicable fair market rent minus any utility allowances. Under project-based vouchers, under the first component of the demonstrations, rents also cannot exceed current funding. So as such, the rents are set at the lower of current funding, the reasonable rent, up to 110% of the applicable FMR minus any utility allowance, or the rent requested by the owner.
So that's the initial rent setting. Can you now tell us about how rents can be adjusted over the term of the contract?
Sure. For both PBV and PBRA, under the first component, rents will be adjusted by an operating cost adjustment factor, or an OCAF, as it's commonly known.
All right. So now tell us about the term of the contract. We have a couple of options here.
Right. For project-based rental assistance contracts, the initial term is for 20 years. And for project-based voucher contracts, the initial term is for 15 years. However, the owner can request an additional 5 years onto that initial term for a total of 20 if they make that request to the PHA and the PHA approves the request.
Now, that latter part, the ability under PBVs to go to 20 years, is something that we can do under the statutory authority. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So that's not typical to the PBV program, but under RAD, you'll be able to request up to 20 years. PHA's got to approve it, but that'll be a possibility.
Correct.
Okay, great. So that's pretty clear. Now let's talk a bit about how Mod Rehab owners will work to compete under the first component. What do they need to submit to HUD in the way of an application or other materials?
Right. Well, PBRA and PBV conversions under the first component of RAD are subject to a competition, and Greg will describe that a little later in the presentation. For both PBV and PBRA conversions, owners must submit a financing plan to demonstrate the long-term viability of the project for HUD approval. And again, Greg is going to describe that a little later.
All right, that's very helpful. One of the things that we mentioned at the top was that choice mobility is an important component of the demonstration. So how will choice be offered to residents under Mod Rehab?
Right. Well, Pat, for all PBV conversions, whether it be public housing, Mod Rehab, rent sup, or RAP, they're going to follow the basic PBV regulations, which provides that after 1 year of occupancy in a PBV unit, a resident can choose to move with continued tenant-based assistance. So the housing authority would have to offer that family the first housing choice voucher or other comparable assistance that becomes available when the family makes the request. And for only properties that are converting to PBRA, which can only be public housing or Mod Rehab under the first component, they're required to offer a resident a choice voucher after a minimum of 2 years in occupancy in the PBRA unit.
That's helpful. It's a little detailed, but we should remind all the viewers today that the details of this really are laid out pretty clearly, hopefully, in the notice, and we urge you to go back and review that.
Definitely.
So let's switch now, Diane, to the second component of the demonstration as it relates to Mod Rehab. Can you give us some idea of some of the key provisions under the second component? What do we need to know about there?
Sure, Pat. Actually, I think there's a PowerPoint on the screen for viewers to kind of follow along as well. But under the second component of the demonstration, PBVs will be provided to Mod Rehab owners who are eligible and apply. They will be provided in lieu of tenant protection vouchers that otherwise would be provided to the tenants. Conversions under the second component are non-competitive, but they are subject to the availability of tenant protection voucher funding. Contract rents are set according to the project-based voucher rent rules without the current funding limits that we'll have under the first component of the demonstration. Rent increases will be based on the PBV requirements the owner would request and at the anniversary date, and the rent can be increased by the PHA according to the normal PBV requirements.
Great. That's helpful. Now that we understand that there are really two distinct paths for mod rehab that owners can take, why don't we go into how the owner actually initiates the conversion process? Maybe, Greg, you can help us out with this. So let's go back to how an owner would begin to initiate conversion of assistance under the first component of the demonstration that you described to us on the whiteboard.
Right. So first thing the Mod Rehab owner needs to do is approach the PHA and get their approval. If you already have a PHA that is the contract administrator for that project, and we want to make sure that PHA is okay with this proposal to convert, and so first get the PHA's approval. But once you get the PHA's approval, then the owner will submit an application similar to the procedures we described in the earlier webinars on public housing authorities applying. Is that on the website we've posted a proposed application form, and Mod Rehab owners will submit an application form that essentially it's Excel based, and it will require the owner to walk through a pro forma and show, here's what my current contract rents are, here are my operating costs, and here's the capital needs that I identify for my property, and here's where my first mortgage financing or other sources of funds are going to be able to meet my capital needs for this project. And so we'll ask for the owner to submit us that application, and also if they're going to be requiring first mortgage financing or some other outside financing, as part of the application that they'll submit to us, we also want to see a letter of interest from whatever those sort of third-party sources of funding. Doesn't have to be a firm commitment at this stage, doesn't have to be nailed down, but we want to make sure that someone has at least taken another step and has sort of talked to a lender, and the lender says, yeah, this seems like a feasible project for us.
All right. So the owner submits this application, these materials. Then what happens? How does it get scored, and then how does an owner become aware that it's been selected to move to the next step?
So, Pat, we only have 60,000 units in which we can award, and we've said that 1,250 will go to Mod Rehab. And so we have to create a competitive process. We have to have some process in which to sort of decide which Mod Rehab owners will award to. So what's going to happen is that we're going to, first of all, we've divided the 1,250 units into 4 regions so that PHAs in the Northeast and the South, Midwest, Mod Rehab owners in those 4 regions will compete against themselves. But we have 3 ranking criteria: the extent of capital needs that the project has. So for those projects that are proposing to do more capital work, have a sort of a higher score than those that are proposing lower capital work. Those owners who agree to a green building standard get a priority, and also to the extent that the Mod Rehab owner is able to secure some turnover vouchers from a sponsoring housing authority then for choice mobility, then they also get some points for that. But essentially, by the time they submit the application to us, the Excel application will automatically sort of score the PHA, the owners, Mod Rehab owners, and we expect if the application window opens in 1st of August, if all the schedule goes well, then by the end of August, then we'll sort of close the application window, look at all the applications that receive, and expect that we would then make awards as soon as this September 30th.
All right, so let's stay on this path for a minute. Maybe, Margaret, you can help us as we're kind of shifting over to the Section 8 platform. So once a Mod Rehab project's been approved at that level that Greg described, then what happens?
Sure. So after the approval, HUD will enter into what we're calling a CHAP, which is a commitment to enter into a HAP contract. And the purpose of this CHAP is to provide time for the owner to put together a financing plan for the recapitalization of the property. So the CHAP period is a 180-day period during which the owner is seeking other financing sources. As Greg mentioned, when the owner applies, they're submitting a financing letter of intent, but we fully understand that that's not a full commitment of financing. So during that CHAP period, the owner will be following up and reporting in basic series of milestones, and that includes things like a letter of engagement with a lender, due diligence reports for their project capital needs assessment, and then finally submission of the evidence of a firm commitment application.
All right, so we don't have to have the financing in place, but then you describe the steps that have to follow after that initial approval, if you will. So what happens after that? What's the next step in the process?
That's right. So again, really the intent of this CHAP period is for the financing to come together, and then HUD will review the financing plan. And there are a series of various financing sources that an owner might look to. And really the intent here is to provide these Mod Rehab owners with the ability to seek outside financing, which I know many owners have been looking for. So that financing may include things like an FHA insured mortgage, either if there's substantial rehab, a 221D4 loan could be a good option for folks, or if there's a moderate level of repairs that are needed, they might look to a 223F insured loan. But there are other sources of finances like conventional loans, low-income housing tax credits, bond financing, financing from state or local government sources, and other sources.
So the pretty typical financing options that are available to any developer of affordable housing.
That's
now,
right.
Now Mod Rehab.
And RAD is designed to be flexible so that owners can look to multiple sources of financing.
All right. That's very helpful. So now let's talk about post-conversion. This has been approved by HUD. We've gone through that process that you just described. So as a mod, let's stick with PBRA, Project-Based Rental Assistance, for a minute. As that project moves to post-conversion under the first component of RAD, what happens then?
Sure. So when the Mod Rehab owner signs a PBRA contract, essentially what they're doing is moving over to a Section 8 contract that will be administered under the regulations at 24 CFR Part 880. And what that means is that it will be overseen by the Office of Multifamily Housing Programs, and it will be under the guidance, standing and subsequent guidance that the Office of Housing may publish related to project-based rental assistance contracts. And what that will look like is things like REAC inspection from the Real Estate Assessment Center, management occupancy reviews performed by a performance-based contract administrator, and other processes for multifamily housing like submission of annual financial statements and reserve for replacement releases and things like that. But I do want to note that there are a few special provisions for RAD converted projects. So if you are selecting a PBRA contract under Section 8, it is a Section 8 contract, but there are a few distinctions. So some of you may have noticed that in our notice we include an attachment that has the regs at Part 880, but there are some strike-throughs. And what we are trying to do is show some of the distinctions for the regulations for these RAD PBRA contracts that are a little bit different than our regular Section 8 contracts. And just a couple things to highlight there. This will be a 20-year contract term, as Diane mentioned. The rent setting and rent adjustments will be a little different than our typical Section 8 contract in that there will only be OCAF adjustments. And of course, one of the major features of these contracts is that they will have this choice mobility component where there will be this opportunity for tenants to move after a 2-year period.
Okay. So that explains if an owner chooses to convert to project-based rental assistance. Let's come back to you now, Diane, and maybe you can walk us through what rules apply if an owner chooses to convert to project-based vouchers.
Sure. So, Pat, under the first component of RAD, if an owner chooses to convert to project-based vouchers, generally the regular PBV rules will apply. But as we've mentioned, under the first component, the Congress actually gave us some pretty broad waiver authority. And we've waived a number of regulatory provisions, a couple of statutory provisions, and provided for some alternative provisions as well. And all of those things are in the notice and can be found in Section 2 of the notice, which is the section for Mod Rehab. But there are two things that I wanted to note that would be of interest to Mod Rehab owners, one of which is under the regular project-based voucher program, a housing authority is required to run a competition to select owner proposals. And under RAD, under the first and second components actually of the demonstration, that provision is waived. So the owner will not have to compete for the project-based voucher assistance. And another important waiver has to do with the income mixing requirements that are mandatory in the regular PBV program. Basically, what the regular PBV program requires is that not more more than 25% of the units in a project may be assisted under the PBV program unless certain exceptions are met. And those exceptions are for single-family properties, for elderly properties, for disabled properties, and for family properties where the tenants are actually receiving supportive services that are offered by the PHA. One modification that we've made to that provision under the first component of RAD is to offer services to the families as opposed to requiring that they receive those services. We're hoping that tenants will take advantage, but at the same time, we do not want to displace families who choose not to participate in the services, and the assistance is changing through no fault of their own. So that's one important change as well. And as far as PHAs are concerned, they would be happy to know that the waiver authority provided to us by Congress allows us to not require that these PBV contracts count towards their 20% limitation on the amount of project-based voucher assistance, on the amount of tenant-based assistance that can actually be project-based.
All right. So RAD conversions in effect are exempt from that cap, so they really don't count against that. PHA doesn't have to worry about that.
Right.
All right. So you've been describing the competitive portion of Mod Rehab, or the left side of the whiteboard, if you will, that we talked about earlier. There's also, we mentioned, the ability to convert to PBVs on the second part of the demonstration. We talked a little bit about how that works, but if an owner chooses to go that route, what should he or she expect will be some of the things that they have to do here?
Okay. Well, the PBV contract is provided in lieu of tenant protection vouchers that would otherwise be provided to tenants when an owner opts not to renew its Mod Rehab HAP contract. The owner has to submit a request to the PHA that is currently administering the Mod Rehab contract, and I believe there's a screenshot that viewers can kind of follow along, and that information is also in the notice. It kind of gives the procedure in terms of submitting the request to the PHA and the time frames involved. But there are a couple of important things that I'd like to point out. The request, it has to be submitted within 120 days prior to the contract expiration. So that's just an important date that owners need to keep in mind.
Well, let me stop you on that one. It's a pretty complex diagram up there. So what happens if a Mod Rehab contract is set to expire before that 120-day period that you just described? What are the options for the owner then?
Right. Well, those that are looking to convert their properties prospectively, we've built into the requirements the possibility for a short-term renewal to facilitate the conversion process when the expiration will occur within that 120 days. So that's basically our attempt at trying to make the process easier for owners.
To get you to that point and then convert
exactly
in that fashion. Okay,
right.
Great.
Right. So I just wanted to just get back to the section that deals with conversions under the second component of RAD. It's important to note that there is a tenant notification requirement, that tenants are provided with a 30-day period to provide comments on the conversion. The PHA will review the owner's request and the tenant comments, and if more than 50% of the written comments that are received by the housing authority disapprove of the conversion, then the PHA will contact the owner to discuss options for proceeding with the conversion request, or they may decline the request. However, if the PHA does consent, the owner submits the financing plan that we spoke of earlier and the PHA certification that, in fact, the conversion does satisfy the requirements of the notice. That would be submitted to HUD headquarters. HUD headquarters will then review that financing plan, make sure that the benchmarks for feasibility are met, financial feasibility, and HUD headquarters will then issue the vouchers to the housing authority, and the housing authority will enter into either a project-based voucher HAP contract or an AHAP, depending on whether rehabilitation is required.
All right, there's a lot of details there. So we're going to urge all the participants that are interested to take special attention to this section of the notice to review these details. But we're not done yet. just to make it interesting, I think, the Congress also granted us the authority under this second component of the demonstration that we're talking about to go back retroactively. So there's an authority to convert these vouchers to project-based vouchers that goes back. Can you explain how that works?
Sure, sure. Well, properties where the Mod Rehab HAP contract or renewal contract expired after October 1st, 2006 are eligible under RAD, provided that the tenants that receive the tenant protection voucher assistance are still residing in those units. But there's one important distinction that I'd like to make. Under Section 8T of the United States Housing Act, Mod Rehab owners that choose not to renew their contracts the tenants in those units are allowed to receive enhanced voucher assistance, and that is a category of tenant protection vouchers. So readers will note that in the notice we refer to enhanced vouchers, and I just wanted to make clear that that is a category of tenant protection assistance. So the owners will be able to convert that assistance to project-based voucher assistance retroactively. And one of the main differences between prospective and retroactive conversions has to do with the tenant notification and comment. Families under the prospective conversion are given the ability to actually comment on the conversion. Under the retroactive conversion, families have to actually consent to the conversion. Since they currently have enhanced vouchers, they have to be notified, they have to be briefed on the differences between the two programs, how the conversion will impact their rent payments, how the conversion will impact their ability to move with their voucher. So those are important things that the family has to be briefed on under the retroactive conversions.
And that would make a lot of sense. They've been living there with, in essence, an enhanced voucher that now is going to be converted to a project-based voucher. So everybody needs to sort of say, yes, this makes sense, let's do it. And we're encouraging both the residents and the owners to work together on that. That's really the only way forward. Is that correct?
Correct,
Okay,
yes.
great. So before we turn to taking some of the questions that are starting to come in now, Diane, can I just ask you, or any of the other at the table, are there any other important details on Mod Rehab that we should be paying attention to that you'd like to highlight, and then we'll go to questions.
Right. Well, most of the details are certainly covered in our notice under Section 2. We, touched on some of them here, but please review and get an idea of what's required. There's a lot of detail. But a couple of the things that we just want to remind folks of is that the comments are due April 9th. The Mod Rehab portion of the notice is proposed, so we are looking to receive public comment on the notice. There's a 30-day application period for conversions under the first component, and it's expected to begin on August 1st. Mod Rehab conversions under the second component can get started with submissions 120 days prior to the expiration date of the HAP contract after the final notice is published.
Okay, great. That's helpful. Before we go to questions, I just want to remind all of our participants that we're in our third webcast this week. Those are archived on our webpage at www.hud.gov/rad. And so you can find those if you hadn't had a chance to tune in, or some of your colleagues may be interested in them. And then further, you can send us questions about Mod Rehab or public housing or Rents Up and Wrap, which we'll cover in an upcoming webcast in the next hour. You can submit those questions, but those won't be considered formal comments. You need to follow the comment procedures in the notice to register a formal comment. But we're happy to take your questions, and you can submit those to us via email at rad@hud.gov. So we've got a few questions that have come in by email, so let's turn to those and see if we can help out with some of that. So let's see, here's one. We've talked a bit about this, Diane, but let's come back to it. In the project-based voucher program, isn't there a rule that not more than 25% of the units in a building can be assisted? You mentioned that's being changed under RAD. Can you go through that again? We have authority to do this.
We do. So under the first component of RAD, as I mentioned, we have pretty broad waiver authority. But under the second component of RAD, we also have the ability to waive a couple of the statutory provisions and the associated regulatory provisions. And one of those is the income mixing requirement for the PBV program. Basically, what that requires is that not more than 25% of units in a project may be project-based, with the exception of elderly, disabled, single-family properties, and family properties where the tenants are actually receiving supportive services. I think I failed to mention this earlier. For the purposes of RAD, however, we've increased that percentage to 50%. So 50% of the units are eligible to be project-based under the voucher program. Where an owner wishes to go beyond that 50% in a family property, the families under the normal program would be required to receive the supportive services offered by the Public Housing Authority. Under RAD, we are lessening the impact on families who choose not to participate in the supportive services and only requiring that the PHA offer those services. But if the family declines to participate, their assistance is not affected, they're not terminated, they're not required to move out of the accepted unit, but rather they can continue in occupancy. But once that family does vacate the unit, the next family referred to the unit off of their waiting list would have to comply with the normal PBV requirements, which is to receive supportive services in order for that unit to be accepted under the PBV program.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
I see a couple more questions here, but let me just remind the viewers that you can still submit your email questions before we wrap up, probably in another 5 or 10 minutes at most, to rad@hud.gov. Here's another one that's a bit related, Diane, maybe again for you. So if a Mod Rehab owner converts its project to project-based vouchers, as distinct from PBRA, and I think Margaret talked about what happens here, the participant wants to know who will administer the PBV HAP contract in that case, not PBRA, but PBV. How does that work?
It actually will be the administering housing authority. Right now, Mod Rehab contracts are administered by local public housing authorities. And that's the same housing authority that administers the Mod Rehab contract currently will be the housing authority that will administer the project-based voucher contract.
Okay, great. There's a couple questions related to choice mobility for residents, and so let me take them one at a time. Maybe, Greg, you can help with one of these. The first one is, when a resident exercises his or her choice mobility or right to move option, does the subsidy remain on the property or leave with the family? I think the answer is both.
Remains, well, yeah, right. So for the owner, to be clear, that the assistance remains with the property, and it's project-based assistance, whether it's PBRA or PBV, so it's project-based. Where is the family then getting the subsidy to move? And what it's doing is it's accessing the turnover vouchers that the voucher agency has in its voucher program. So, but definitely the assistance, if a property owner, Mod Rehab owner has 100 units and they're converting all 100 to PBV, those units are fixed at that property.
So this is a little bit like public housing that we talked about yesterday, is a lot of this is going to depend on the ability of a housing authority to have turnover vouchers to support the choice mobility program. But not every housing authority has vouchers to do this. So can you suggest some of the things that we're trying to make work for public housing, choice mobility options that also apply here to Mod Rehab? What are we doing to kind of get housing authorities maybe to help one another or to relieve the obvious constraints?
Under the first component of the bill, if a housing authority is converting to PBRA, or if Mod Rehab owner is converting to PBRA, we allow the housing authority that will be providing the turnover vouchers to limit up to 1/3 of their turnover vouchers to support choice mobility. So it's a way of sort of capping it so it doesn't create too much of a burden on their program.
And the reason for that is you were a director of a housing authority, so you face a lot of demand on your turnover vouchers for the homeless.
And in recent years, the turnover rates, turnback rates in the voucher program have gone down. There's sort of fewer people because the markets are tight in a lot of places, so people are holding on to their vouchers. And so when able to sort of not crowd out others who are already on the waiting list, this is a way of sort of limiting the choice vouchers under RAD.
Okay, great. That's helpful. So we have one, well, there's a two-part question here. I'm not sure if it's from two viewers or from one, but let's try it. Margaret, you talked a little bit about financing. And the question is, do you expect lenders to participate in the program? And will RAD projects be eligible for FHA insurance, tax credits, and other tools? You touched on that a bit, but let's talk a minute about the lender participation in this. You work a lot with lenders on the Section 8 side of the program. I had the opportunity to speak with some lenders and investors yesterday, and I think the general reaction is that these are Section 8 contracts, be they PBRA or PBV, and they have a lot of experience with that. But if you maybe want to comment on that.
Absolutely. So really one of the components here of RAD is this idea that the Section 8 contract and the idea that you can leverage a Section 8 contract to bring in debt and equity financing to a project is really a proven model. It's something that we do all the time in the Office of Multifamily Housing Programs, and it's both with conventional lending and FHA insured lending. So it's something that I think lenders are very familiar with, they're comfortable with. It's a source of rental assistance that folks have been able to leverage successfully. And I would say to folks that, again, FHA insured financing might be a good vehicle, and if owners are interested in pursuing that, they should work with what we call a MAP approved lender, so a HUD approved FHA lender, to put together an application for financing, and they can also approach the multifamily field office who can help them with that financing application.
All right, that's helpful. There's a related question that's come up, and maybe Diane, you can help me, but I'll start it. And the question is basically this: if under the demonstration there are no additional funds provided, what's the advantage of an owner thinking about converting to this form of assistance? There's no more money. We're not going to be able to adjust the initial contract rents. There'll be limited OCAF adjustments. So the questioner is wondering, why should I do this? Let me start with one thing, and then maybe you can talk about, from your experience, some other advantages here.
Yeah. I think that for owners that are interested in converting under the first component of RAD, that this is an excellent opportunity for them to leverage funding, as Margaret was discussing, through the ability to take, a long-term contract to the bank or to their investors and say, hey, I have this long-term contract, invest in my property. So I think that that's one of the advantages for owners under the first component of RAD. And for owners that are interested in converting to PBV under the second component, the advantage there again is to get the long-term contract up to 15 years under the regular PBV program. And also, in many cases, they'll be able to get increased rents that they've been restrained from receiving under the regular Mod Rehab renewal option under MARA. So under the second component of RAD, an owner is eligible to get rents of up to 110% of the FMR. Currently, under the renewal contract, the rents are restrained to the lower of the contract rent adjusted by an OCAF, 120% of the FMR, or the comparable rent. And I've heard from many owners that the restraints on the rents are not enough to allow them to do the repairs that they need to do to the units to just be able to financially stay above water. So this will be a great opportunity for owners to get a long-term contract and get rents that hopefully will help them manage and repair their projects in an efficient way.
So the real obvious benefit is, and Mod Rehab owners know this well, you have to come in once a year. It's nice to come in and see you once a year, or the local PHA, but basically they have to come in once a year to get renewal on a year-to-year basis, but now we're essentially converting to long-term contracts. I mean, that's basically the advantage.
Right, and that's one thing we've heard from many Mod Rehab owners, that they would like long-term contracts to coincide with low-income housing tax credits requirements. And so this is an opportunity for owners to get a 15-year project-based voucher contract or a project-based rental, 20-year project-based rental assistance contract. And of course, with all federal programs, it's subject to annual appropriations. However, the track record is that these contracts are being funded. So definitely.
Okay, great. I see it looks like one last question. There may be another one coming we'll have a couple minutes for, but let's consider this the last question for now. Greg, maybe, again, putting your hat back on as a former ED of a housing authority, here's the question. What if a local public housing authority does not operate a PBV program, has no record experience in doing it up to date, or declines to participate in the conversion? How come we're having to involve them with this mod rehab process?
Right. What I'm actually going to do is turn to Diane to do this one. Go ahead, Diane.
Sure. So first off, the project-based voucher program is discretionary. So if a housing authority has a Section 8 voucher program, they can choose to operate a PBV program. And housing authorities that are currently administering mod rehab contracts, I would say 99.9% of them also administer a voucher program. Mm-hmm. So the housing authority, at its discretion, could enter into a project-based voucher relationship with a mod rehab owner under RAD. I would recommend that they familiarize themselves, of course, with the project-based voucher program regulations. If they have any questions, they can feel free to contact us here at HUD, and we'd be more than happy to try to walk them through any concerns they have about initiating a PBV program. One thing that has to be done is that they'll have to provide for it in their administrative plan. There's certain selection criteria. There's there's a number of issues that have to be addressed in their Section 8 administrative plan. So the first thing would be to make sure that they understand the project-based voucher program, but it's totally within their discretion to operate. We don't have to give them any authority to do so. And in terms of a PHA having to consent, the statute actually requires that the administering agency also administer the conversions, the RAD conversions for mod rehab projects. So if that particular agency declines, then the owner is not eligible to participate under the second component of the conversion.
Right, and the thinking there is that local public housing agency is going to know a lot about the project, the market, and if there's some problem there, they'd be in the better position to sort of make that judgment. Is that correct? Yes. Okay.
And then just to add to that, that if the PHA does not want to enter into this PBV contract, that there is the opportunity for the mod rehab owner to instead go the PBRA route.
Right, okay. And so we'd have to look at whatever issues might have been raised. Again, the PHA, we're going to have some understanding of that, but that would be that option. Okay, well, I think that is our last question, so let's wrap up today. I'll remind our viewers that in about 15 minutes we're going to turn to a focus in another webcast on the rent, sup, and wrap portions on the right side of the whiteboard that you saw earlier, how that works in the bill, and I think that will be of obvious interest to those owners because they have expiring subsidies, and that's the whole purpose of the RAD authority, is to help those rent, sup, and wrap properties and owners, and frankly the residents who are very interested in a lot of cases of seeing those properties extended. So we'll come back in about 15 minutes and we'll begin to focus on that. But thank you, everyone, and again, you can find this webcast or previous webcasts. We had a general overview earlier in the week. We had a detailed discussion yesterday with Greg about public housing. Those will be listed on our webpage. One or two of them may be up there now, but they'll all be up there as soon as possible. So thank you, everyone.